Before we end our show tonight, we would like to welcome TMN Digital Director Senior Ingrid Roettgen to the studio. Ms. Roettgen and 27 other students went to Iowa this weekend to report on the caucuses. We invited her to come share her experiences at the Iowa Caucuses. Welcome, Ingrid.
Thanks for having me, Lyndall.
So, Ingrid, can you explain to the viewers what exactly the Iowa caucuses are about?
Yeah, absolutely. So the caucuses for Iowa are kind of like the primaries that we have here in Missouri, except for they run a little bit differently. It depends on whether or not you're Republican or a Democrat how you vote. For the Republican caucuses, each candidate typically has a representative who stands up and gives a speech about why you should vote for that candidate. And then afterwards, there's a round of secret ballot voting, and then those ballots are later counted to decide who wins the caucus for Iowa. For the Democratic caucuses, though, they run a little bit differently. There's usually everyone gathers in a big auditorium or a gymnasium, and precinct leaders representing different candidates stand in different parts of the room. And the people who show up to vote then move to those parts of the room for the candidate that they want to vote for. So it's based off of body count rather than based off of a ballot vote. What's interesting about the way that the Democratic caucuses work is that you get to listen to a lot of debate and discussion between the people who are there, talking to their friends or their family, trying to convince them to come to one part of the room or the other. Sometimes the precinct leaders will also bring cookies or cupcakes to give to people who end up voting for their candidate. So it can be really fun to watch that exchange take place. Another really interesting thing about the Democratic caucuses is that if a candidate doesn't have 15% of the votes inside of the room, they're considered unviable and you can't vote for that candidate any longer. So, for example, a lot of people were expecting O'Malley to not reach the 15% viability mark, which at the caucus that I attended meant that he would have to have less than 73 people in his corner of the room. He actually ended up having over 100, so he ended up reaching viability. But had he not, those people who were voting for him would have had to move to a different candidate and vote for either Hillary or Bernie instead.
Wow. Sounds like a really hectic place.
Yeah.
How was the media treated when you guys were there?
Well, it really depended on what rallies you were attending as media, how those candidates chose to treat the media who were there to cover the events. As student journalists, it was really interesting to watch because we were right up there with the other journalists from BBC and CNN and AP, right mixed in there with the crowd. For going to rallies like Bernie's rallies, they typically had a lot less security. People really didn't care if the media went out into the crowd to take pictures or interview people. It was a lot more relaxed. Obviously, for candidates that had Secret Service accompanying them on their campaigns, things were a little bit more tight. You had a little bit more restrictions on you. But the tightest restrictions that we had for any of the candidates whose rallies we attended were definitely for Donald Trump's rallies. Once you checked in to the rally as credentialed media, they put you in this little bullpen that had kind of gates around it, and they stationed campaign managers and police around the edges, and once you were in there, you weren't actually allowed to leave this bullpen and go interview people or take pictures of anything. So it felt very restrictive, kind of uncomfortable, maybe a little bit unconstitutional. I'm not exactly sure how I've really felt about it, but it definitely was not a good place to be.
So did they differentiate between international, national, local, or student media while you were at the rallies?
As far as the way that the media were treated, not really. If you were a student journalist, a local journalist, you were all put in the same spot together. Really, the big difference came for a lot of the international journalists that we had talked to, people who had come from different parts of Europe and other parts of the world to come cover the caucuses, since they do have such a big impact on the rest of the world. We actually spoke to a lot of international journalists at some of these events who said that they had had a lot of trouble getting into Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton's rallies, which was really interesting that they had been denied credentials to some of those events Some people said that it may have been because they weren't as concerned with international media covering the event and wanted to have national media who were actually going to get the message to their voters out. Other people said that they just had issues with international media coming in and covering their events because they didn't like the things that they were saying about them. But that was really the big difference in the treatment of media that I saw with the international journalists.
Yeah, I guess each candidate has their own agenda. Did you get to meet any of the candidates while you're there?
I unfortunately did not get to personally meet any of the candidates or interview them or ask them any questions. A lot of the time they gave their preference to the national media who was there with the big cameras who they knew were going to put them on live TV. So our group didn't really get to interview a lot of journalists. What was interesting was the only candidates who we were really able to get up close to and take pictures of and maybe ask a couple of passing questions here and there were the smaller candidates like O'Malley, like Santorum, like Huckabee, like O'Malley. Those candidates we were able to actually get up close to them, talk to them, take pictures of them. So that provided a more intimate experience, I think.
Did they act any differently, you think, than what you saw them on TV?
It really depended on the event and what was going on. Marco Rubio is a lot more charismatic on person than he is on TV, surprisingly. And the Donald Trump rally that we attended, he actually, most of the time when you see him on TV, he's yelling and shouting and being really emphatic. But he just, at the rally that I attended, just really didn't have that much energy, I guess. He had been on the road for a really long time, and the caucuses were about to come to a close, so maybe he was just tired. But towards the end of the rallies, I noticed the candidates kind of maybe started losing some steam.
So what would you say was the most surprising experience for you at the caucuses?
I don't know if there was any one experience that was surprising to me, but I think the thing that was most interesting or shocking to me was the fact that no one really cared if we were student journalists or if we were national media. Once we were in the media bullpen, we were the same as all of the other journalists. And it actually gave me a little bit more confidence knowing that people were treating me with the same respect or disrespect as some of the other media outlets that were there. People didn't care that we were just small student journalists from the middle of nowhere, Missouri, writing for our small student newspaper. They really wanted us to either take pictures of them and interview them and get their story out there, or they wanted us to leave them alone. So I guess for me, the most encouraging and also kind of surprising thing was just that it didn't matter that we were student journalists. We were just part of the media group while we were there.
Nice. Well, thanks for joining us, Ingrid.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on.